Well, let me start by saying the periods that we identified on the mountain metaphor had actually been developed before I came up with the mountain as a metaphor. So that's in the 94 paper, which is, a little dense, no pictures, but it was an attempt to characterize the behavior of the developing infant and child and later adult, rather than in the old and traditional way. So if you look at all the ways in which other people have created periods, they have never started with that first period of life, and which is the first 2 weeks approximately. Remember, these are only estimates, these time periods. But at birth, what characterizes the baby's behavior? And most people just say, oh, this is when they do all the things. Well, not the first 2 weeks. The trauma of coming through the birth canal is so extreme for the baby that Mother Nature needs to provide them with things to survive in their movement. And so they have two things that they already had in the womb. They had reflexes and they had spontaneous movements. These are behaviors that were in the womb, and now you come out from a microgravitational world into a gravitational world. That means that all of a sudden your limbs are a lot heavier than they were when you were a baby, you were a fetus. So the neonate, when they come out, it's like, wow, whoa, what's this? So you can't just assume that they'll be able to move typically, as it were. So they'll have these reflexes that will ensure their survival. And that's what Mother Nature's done with the reflexive period. That doesn't last very long. And then everybody else just says you go through these sort of, almost phylogenetic skills that babies, they sit, they roll over, they stand, they walk, and so on. But again, I'll go back to Jerome Bruner, who had this idea, that had the idea of the mountain as well. He once wrote a paper on, quote, pre-adapted behaviors. And pre-adapted is this idea that if you come into the world with sort of a tendency or a sort of favoritism towards certain kinds of behaviors, that'll make it easier if you come into just certain environments. So I always say, if we were born on the moon, we wouldn't crawl, But we would have always had the pre-adaptation to do those kinds of patterns. So when we come into the world, you'll see the precursors of our walking right at the very beginning. We have the walking reflex, okay, but it's a pre-adapted behavior. We have the spontaneous behaviors of flexion and extension, and these behaviors really prime the system. And then in the context of the floor, your playpen, your crib, your parent's lap, you begin to explore all these kinds of patterns that are within the system. Some people have actually called them coordinative structures. There's an old paper in 1972 by Easton who says these are all in the system as, quote, coordinative structures. Well, the system certainly, the neuromuscular system, has these tendencies to do like flexion extension patterns in certain ways, and also together. So when I move my arms like this, that's not a real surprise. It's not like I just created that, but rather these patterns were in my nervous system from the start. So I picked up this, again, being very influenced by Jerome Bruner, picked up this idea that these are not just, the first year behaviors of babies, but really they're pre-adaptations to our behaviors that we will then use. From there, then, where do we go? I mean, we're on our way to going up the mountain to becoming very skillful. So we come into the world with these predisposed or pre-adapted behaviors. What does it mean to go next? Well, okay, so let's just think about it. We have this multi-segmented body. I have every place I have a joint, I can deform. Okay, so if I put my hands down to support my body weight, or I put my legs down to support my body weight, every time I have a joint, that joint could collapse. Okay, and when it collapses, then I could deform. Okay, so the problem for the developing child in their motor skills is to figure out how to manage these joints. Okay, so let's just take the hip and the knee and the ankle, the easiest ones. So what do babies do when you hold them up on your lap when they're in the pre-adaptive period? You've got them in your lap and they're bouncing. And they like to bounce. They kind of give and they go. They give and they extend. So they have flexion, extension of the joints, flexion, extension of the joints. And you play with them and you toss them back and forth. And, they laugh with glee and so on. And then later they'll go along the couch and they'll do the same thing themselves. So when they're 9 or 10 months old, they might stand and do this kind of cruising action, and they might do this bouncing, babies dancing, we sometimes call it. But the idea is that the system is working out these patterns of coordination. That is the ordering or co-ordering of these behaviors, that is, of the segments. So, all right, that's fine. We get to the end of the first year, and we say, okay, at the end of the pre-adaptive period, we're ready to go. We have the two things we need in life. Being able to eat, that's hand-eye coordination. Get the food in front of you, get it in your mouth. Now, it's messy, babies do this and they get it all over their face. That's why we have bibs for them, But they can reach out, pick up their Cheerio and put it in their mouth. They can reach out and play with their spoon. They're not using their spoon at 1 year, but they can do self-feeding. And that is, think about it, farther on down the mountain or up the mountain, you have this hand-eye coordination now becomes the hand-eye coordination for ball skills, okay? Now, balls are moving, but hopefully your food isn't moving, but when you're eating, you have to be able to reach out and get what you want and bring it to your mouth, all right? So you have, at the end of probably around 10 or 11 months of age, babies are able to do independent self-feeding. But the other part is you have to get to your food. So now you have to have locomotion. At that point, you have all the motor skills to survive. Pretty much, you have the foundation of what you need. You need to transport yourself someplace, and you need to be able to eat. But of course, as human beings, as animals in the animal kingdom, we have to actually go get food. We have to prepare food. We have to grow food. We have to kill food if we're, doing hunters and gatherer kind of things. So the human beings, like animals, have the need to have these other skills, not just being able to get up and walk from here to there or being able to feed themselves. They have to be able to do a whole array of culturally determined behaviors to survive, okay? Let's not think sports skills right now or the technical skills of typing or handwriting, but just think about the skills you need to survive. So as a human, we have these early motor behaviors in place. Now, for the next 6 or 7, or maybe even much longer than that, you then have to work out the gross motor patterns of coordination. These are what we sometimes call the fundamental patterns of coordination. Motor development is always going on, even if you can't get these to start with, or even if you do get them. Could you stop there? Well, those are the goals of all. To be an independent person, you need to have those two things. You need to be able to feed yourself, and you need to be able to get where you want to go. Is that enough? Yeah, for some people that would probably be just fine. But in our culture today, you generally have to have some kind of manual skills. You have to be able to dress yourself. You need to be able to use a pen or a pencil or a typewriter or something like that. You have to be able to do other tool use. Do you have to play baseball? No. That baseball is not in every culture. So of course not. You don't have the sport game skills that we have. But we have the fundamental skills for survival, like tool use, I would say, and gross motor skills for climbing and walking and so on, and running. So fundamental motor skills are one of those words we often use, but never really think about. We don't take them apart and think, what does it mean? So if you're taking this class, the teacher says, what are the fundamental motor skills, and you write a list down. But what does it really mean? It basically, these are patterns that will be seen across all cultures. So across every culture, all humans who are typical, so I'm not talking about people who are born with a disability, will walk. They will run. When they try to go faster and faster and faster, their walking will turn into running. They will trip, and so they will hop. Okay, so you trip up your foot, you'll hop. You'll try to catch up, and you'll do a gallop. So that's a gallop being one long step and one short step. Skipping is seen, most people say, it's skipping. Does everybody skip? Actually, one of my friends once called it the happy gait. And in fact, most cultures will have some form of skipping. So it's hopping a step on one foot and hop a step on the other foot. So these are considered to be phylogenetic, meaning all people of the human species will do these behaviors if, in fact, they are given enough opportunity and they don't have a disability. But are they, quote, fundamental? I've tended to think of them as fundamental patterns of coordination. That is, in order to get from here to there, my legs can move in different ways. They can do this 180 degree out of phase or 50-50 phasing, which is walking and running, or they can be asymmetric, which would be like a gallop. So you have this sort of 2-to-1, one long step, one short step. And then you can kind of play around with them. You can do jumping, you can do leaping, you can do galloping, giddy up, and then you can do skipping. Those are playful gaits, or gaits that are used for certain kinds of gross motor activities. And the system, particularly the jump, the neuromotor system needs to figure out how to maximize these or create these patterns of coordination. I tend to try to not call them fundamental skills because they're not skillful. They're tasks. But we call them a skill because that means that we would characterize them that way. I say, like, handwriting is a motor skill, but you may not be skillful at it. Throwing a ball is a motor skill, but it isn't something that necessarily says you are skillful. And the fundamental motor patterns, sometimes called the fundamental motor skills, are these building blocks for later behaviors that you need to work out for this deformable body. Remember, my trunk and my arms and my head all have to sort of keep balanced over my moving legs. And that all has to be coordinated so that I don't just fall over every time I try that. And that's not a simple task. Because what we're going to do is we're going to take our fundamental patterns of coordination and we're going to parameterize them or use them in different contexts to make them better so that they're, if we use the word skillful, which is they are efficient, biomechanically, psychologically, and physiologically efficient. So that's what I want to do. Is on the way to becoming skillful, it doesn't have to be tennis. It doesn't have to be swimming or gymnastics or dance. It can be anything. So speaking, which is a hugely complex motor skill to learn, and that children go through as well, and handwriting, these are all important skills that everyone has. So why not do those? So then as I did that, I thought, well, I can't call this doesn't make any sense to call this a sport-specific skill. Let's call it the context-specific. That is, it's specific to certain contexts. And that's a long period also. But one of the things that got lost in this is that people just sort of put it in a certain place. Context-specific also means there's changes in cognitive development. You can't become a good tennis player or a good basketball player until you understand the strategies and the rules. A 5-year-old child doesn't understand the strategies or rules of a sport yet. Well, I suppose you could really work on that. But generally, they don't have the cognitive development to get these kinds of ideas. And that's one of the other things that I think is inherent in the concept of motor development that I have, which is that it's not just all the motor system, but it's a perceptual system, the cognitive system, and the social environment in which you are developing. So the culture is so important. But every culture has its culturally promoted behaviors. And they might be dancing in some cultures. They might be singing in some cultures. They might be, football or soccer, as we would call it here. Or it could be, swimming or anything like that. The point is that as we move from the fundamental patterns of coordination, we now take these fundamental patterns, collect them up, and put them together into more complex motor skills and use them in certain contexts. So now it's not just running, it's running in a certain way, okay? It's not just throwing, but it's throwing to a specific target at a certain time. So this cognitive development is so important, and that context-specific period is where the child's sort of cognition or their thinking skills become part of their motor skill repertoire as they learn certain contexts. And then, of course, you go only, most of us, start on this continuum of the skillful period. Skillful, though, is on a continuum from good, skillful enough, to an expert, all right, or Olympian-like. So remember, the skillful period is this very long period of becoming better and better at something. And of course, we don't all become good at everything, obviously. But if I said to you, sign your name, you could do that without even thinking. The skillful period is sort of this long, continuous period where maybe you get to the top of the mountain and you become an Olympic player, and maybe you're a very skillful speaker, a very skillful writer, or a typist, or a piano player. But even in piano playing, you could be very good. Every Christmas, you could play all the Christmas songs for everyone, but are you good enough to actually go to Carnegie Hall and play? No, of course not. And then there's the last stage. Okay, so you get to the top of the mountain, and you can say, why is the last stage called compensation? But the point was that all of a sudden I realized that skillful was on a continuum in which it isn't just about aging. It isn't about getting old and your motor skills go downhill, but rather you compensate at many times in your life as your skillfulness comes down, and you compensate for the change in something in your body and your individual capabilities. And yes, a lot of those are associated with aging, but they don't have to be. So a person, even when they age or they have a serious injury, they can recover from that, and then they can compensate. There are many old people who compensate for their slowness, but are very clever at playing by just dropping the ball just there and throwing, the ball just where you're not, because they're using their head rather than their body. So, all you need to know is, I play golf, and there are many old people, very old people, who could still beat me at golf because they've just learned to compensate for their lack of big power and their long hits, and are now cleverer in other ways in the game. So the compensation period, I just refuse to call it the old age period or anything like that, because I think it happens at any time when you have skill and you have to compensate for that skill. And yes, it of course happens more at the end of the continuum, but it's happened to you, I'm sure.